Hey, so welcome back. This is the second of a series of tutorials on how to do a basic mix with your tracks. The first one was just about how to open up the session, get it ready, taking you through what's on here and what kind of things you might encounter when you're getting it ready a project to mix. So now we're going to be dealing with sorting out the individual channels themselves. Because the problem is that sometimes I see students that I teach immediately start reaching for these faders when they've got no effects on and start trying to do a mix. And that's all well and good, apart from that you can get the best mix in the world, but as soon as you start sticking EQ and compression and reverb on there, it completely changes the balance. So that balance that you worked so hard to get is now you're going to have to redo. So the whole point of this stage is to get each individual channel sounding as good as it possibly can do, so that when you balance things together, you're dealing with good quality compressed and EQ channels rather than uncompressed ones that are just the raw recordings. We're going to be going through these one by one and showing you what order you should be putting things on here. Just something to say that I didn't mention in the last video is that there is actually a document that goes with this if you want to read along or you want to read without having to watch this video, and there'll be a link in the bottom, but it basically just goes through all the things that we're going to talk about in this video. So it goes through the whole mixing stage and it goes through everything that we're going to look at today. So you can click on the link at the bottom and you can download that. So here's our little project here, and we've got the mixer window open, and where do you even start? Well, what you do is you just basically work your way through each individual instrument and get them sounding as good as they possibly can do. Just before we start, I've done like a little bit of a fudge here. Basically these guitars, let's just have a listen to the guitars on their own. So the problem here is that I thought these guitars sounded a little bit tinny to start off with, and the playing is fantastic, but the actual sound coming through the amp is not the greatest. You know, we've got fairly standard amps at college, and students don't have, you know, £1.5 Les Pauls. They usually have affordable guitars. So there's a problem here. So I've kind of fudged this by what I've done is that amp modeler that I talked about before. I actually put an amp modeler on this channel here. I know it sounds slightly counterintuitive because what we're doing here is taking this amped up signal from the guitar and we're putting it through another amp modeler. But what you can actually do is you can by putting it through another amp modeler, you can kind of fudge a better sounding guitar if you really spend a little bit of time. So what I did here before, just between the videos, is I stuck just the amp modeler and Logic on, and I'll just show you before and after. So here's the guitar, just the raw recording that we had before. Yeah, and it's not a great way of working, but this was recorded a few years back and it was recorded in the studio by students that have since left college. So there's no way of recreating this guitar with the people and the setup that it was recorded at the time. So in order to kind of slightly fudge things, I've added an amp modeler onto these channels. It's not the usual way of doing things, and I suggest that by far and away the easiest way to sort this problem is to actually record it properly in the first place and take time over the recording process. But it is a bit of a kind of in case of emergency break here kind of fix. So each of these channels, we're going to start off with this guitar channel actually. So in terms of order of effects to put in, so after any amp modelers or anything like that, which you might not even have on your channels, depending on how you put your recordings together, you're going to be using three main effects when you start in your mixing stage. You're going to be using EQ, compression and reverb. Those are your three basic, you need them on every one of your mixes, effects. There are other ones such as chorus and delay and flanger and phaser and those kind of things, but you don't use them all the time. EQ, compression and reverb are the three that you will use on every single mix you do. I don't know any producer that does not use those three on pretty much everything that they do. So what order do you put them in and how do you put them on? So let's start at the beginning. we can put our EQ on either before or after our compressor, and many producers work in either way, and there's pros and cons to both, but for the sake of kind of getting cracking onto this, I'm just going to choose to put my EQ on before my compressor. If you want to go and check out other people's opinions, you can Google it and you have a look at it. But that's what we're going to do today. So just under audio effects, just underneath here, I'm just going to click on there and I'm going to go to EQ and I'm going to choose channel EQ. If you start to get a little bit more advanced, you'll notice in most DAWs there's several types of EQ and they do different things. Logic, and some of these are really, really clever. So match EQ can actually match the EQ of anything that you feed into it. I've used that before to get that real vintage sound on things. It's really cool to feed it something, a vintage recording, and tell it to match the EQ of that. There's some vintage EQs down here that emulate real classic analog piece of equipment. But the one we're going to use at the top is just a normal channel EQ. And when you open an EQ, it looks like this. And the whole EQ settings go from 20 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz at the top. And that is the range of human hearing, or that is the upper and lower limits of human hearing. You'll tend to find that 20 kilohertz, not everybody can hear that high, and certainly the older you get and the more you go to like loud gigs or your hearing gets trashed over the years, you start to lose some of these high frequencies. And the same with the bottom end. Not many people can hear down at the bottom here 20 hertz. So roughly it goes from as loud or as high or as low as the human hearing can go. And there's several bits of EQ you can use here. You can use shelf EQ, that EQ a whole shelf like that. You can use little bands like that, so you can turn it up and down. And in each of these bands as well, you've got a setting called Q that can actually make the band that you're boosting narrower or wider, because if you're trying to pinpoint a frequency, especially something like snare or kick drum like that, you might not want a huge hill like that. You might want it a little bit narrow. And just something before we start working on the EQ is that number one, not every channel needs EQ. If you recorded it properly in the first place, then you might not even need to touch your EQ. Just for example, the vocals on this track sound really good. I don't think I'm going to be using the EQ a whole lot when I'm mixing the vocals, because they're a really good performance, recorded with a good quality mic, and they've used a good technique to do it. Sometimes you might need more of this than others, but you certainly should not be having your mixes with every track looking like this. Which I sometimes see from students, because it's just a huge mess. Let's just recall default here. So in terms of what frequencies though, because we've got a guitar here, and if you don't know what frequencies a guitar works at, then you're stumped already, because you have no idea where you should be reaching. And here is a really handy tip. If you go to whatever search engine you're using, I'm a bit of a hippie, so I'm using Ecosia. If you type in the phrase instrument frequency chart and you click on images, you'll come up with shed loads of images that look like this. And what they are is that loads and loads of really handy producers and sound engineers and mixing engineers have produced these over the years. And if you just click on a random one, let's view image, what they do is they go through human hearing. So you can see it goes from like 20 down the bottom up to 21 kilohertz up the top. And it shows you, it labels them all in terms of sections, and then it goes through each individual instrument down here. So for, where are we at? Electric guitar. So you can actually see where your electric guitar goes from. It goes from about, about 70, 80 kilohertz, 70, 80 hertz down the bottom here. And the top end of information goes to about, 1.5 kilohertz. It's not to say that there's not going to be more information above this or below this on your recording, but it's basically pointing out this is where all the main information in your guitar is, and this is where you want to be looking at EQing. Some of them are even more helpful. This one I was looking at earlier, And sometimes they even split it, so you can see the electric guitar channel here. It shows you girth down the bottom, which is a slightly funny word. It's got presence up the top, and it's got buzz up the top there, and you can try and work out what each of those means. So this goes higher than that frequency chart before because it's sticking in parts of the character of the sound that they didn't address. So I really suggest that if you're really unsure about what instrument frequencies you should be EQing, that check out these instrument frequency charts. They're really, really helpful. The other thing you can do is that in Logic, and hopefully in your DAW as well, when you press play, it actually shows you like a little meter of where the frequencies are. Let me show you. And you can see which frequencies the guitar is triggering and what I'm going to be interested in EQing. Now, something that I noticed when I was doing this before is that the bottom end, there's not a lot down here of information. So you may want to just slightly boost that. And what you can do is, when you're EQing, the trick is just to do subtlety. The easiest thing to do is to find a frequency that you want to look at, turn it all the way up just to find the nice frequencies that you're looking for, and then when you found them, turn it down to a nice level so you've got a nice balance. So let's just turn this up here. And I'm just trying to basically bring out some of these lows and low mids here. It's really tricky because there's actually not that many on the recording, and you can't really EQ things that aren't there. So try to give it a little boost down the bottom here as much as I can do. But sometimes you're just going to have to work with what you've got. The other thing to bear in mind with your EQ is it's good to cut more than you're boosting. And what that means is that if you're trying to balance things out in the track, say your bass guitar doesn't sound as up front as it needs to be in your mix, you can reach for your EQ on your bass and you can try and really crank the bass on it and try and push it through. But it's far cleverer and far easier to do by reaching for instruments that are getting in the way. So if the reason that your bass guitar is not popping out of your mix is because there's too much stuff in the bottom end, then you can reach for your kick and you can take down the frequencies in your kick drum maybe, and maybe that would create space for your bass guitar without having to like force through more frequencies in your mix. The guitars, the other thing I might do is slightly take down this area here because it's particularly loud and a little bit harsh. So let's just have a listen to that. Yeah, that's okay. And like I said before, don't get too het up on any of these stages. If you just starting mixing and the idea of all this EQ and really clever EQing techniques is a little bit beyond you at the moment, then just stick with the basics. Just get a basic kind of sound going. And this is about as extreme as I'd ever use in terms of EQ. Like I said, a lot of the times these vocals on here, I'm hardly be touching the EQ. So after the EQ, so you've EQ'd your channel, you've got it sounding really nice. After the EQ, I'm going to stick on a compressor. Now, if you don't know what a compressor does, you should be using compression on pretty much every channel in your mixes. It's very rare for people to put on channels that are not compressed in their mix, and compression you just need to stick on as an actual effect in your little audio chain, and it's really, really important. And what compression does, if you have no idea what all of these settings do, in a nutshell, compression sets a threshold and it says that any bit of this channel that goes above that threshold is going to get squashed in volume slightly. And what it does, it means that all the loudest bits and the bits that are really peaking on any instrument are going to be tamed a little bit. It's going to take it back. And what that allows you to do is turn up that channel and have a little bit more control of what's going on that channel, because sometimes, especially when you get to your drums and your vocals, the loud bits are really loud and the quiet bits are really quiet, and it's a real mess when you're trying to mix it. So compression squeezes the volume range of the channel and makes it a little bit easier to mix. Now, again, like I said in the previous video, the first time you open this, I had no idea what a compressor was or what it did. In the olden days, when you just have loads of analog equipment, tough. You're going to have to learn how to use it straight away. In the digital world, you've got a few shortcuts. And one of the shortcuts I mentioned before is that there's shed loads of presets. So if you don't know exactly what all of these settings do, you can have a look at presets here. So we can look at guitars, and we can maybe try a... let's try guitar electric, and it'll come up with a load of settings here. There's a load of different emulators of different classic amps up here. So we've got guitar electric, and what we're trying to do with our guitars here is try and get this needle to be moving. If the needle's not moving, what we need to do, the main one that we're going to be using here, even if you don't know what the rest of these do, threshold is really, really important. And what you need to do is, if this is not really moving, then you take the threshold down, so it basically brings the volume at which the compressor kicks in lower, which means that it's going to compress your signal a little bit more. If this is absolutely zipping off the chart down here, because you want it kind of around this -5 level is a really nice level for kind of compression. If it's going up to 10, it's maybe a little bit over compressed, and you should be able to hear that with your ears. If it's barely registering, then it's not really compressing it that much at all. So you want that real nice sweet spot of it coming up here. So I've chosen a nice generic electric guitar compressor. Let's press play and see if we can find that sweet spot. Brilliant. So we've got this really nicely compressed guitar here, and it just slightly squeezes the volume. What it tends to, the overall effect of the compressor is that it makes your loud bits quieter and your quiet bits louder, is essentially what you end up with once you finish putting your track through the compressor. So you've compressed it, and again, it's really worth upskilling your knowledge and working out what all this does, but it's not worth, when you first start mixing, to take all that time to go away when you can actually just put some presets on and actually get a mix working for you, because otherwise you're going to be lost. It's been weeks before you're going to be able to do this mix, if you're going to have to learn how every single piece of this works. So we've got our EQ, we've got a compression, and the last thing that you need to put on a channel is reverb. And what reverb is this guitar has been recorded with a microphone right in front of the speaker, and there's no echo from the room itself. There's no atmosphere of the place it was played. And if you think about it, every single band that you've ever heard in your life has been in an environment where you're hearing all the sound bouncing off the walls, and it sounds like a really natural sound. This sounds really unnatural because it's recorded straight in front of the amp with no reverb on there. So we're going to add some of those natural room reflections. Now, this is important to set up, because you're not going to stick your reverb on here. You're not going to reach through your reverb and stick it on like that. The reason is because what you want to do is, the reverb is the reflections of a particular room. And what I want to try and do with this track is I want to try and make out that all my band are playing in the same space at the same time. So the way to do that is on this channel here, Sends. So what you do is you click on the Sends bit here, and you go to the bus menu, and then you click bus 1. And you'll notice when I click bus 1, it invented this channel here, aux 1. And at the top it says bus 1. And what I'm actually going to do is, at the bottom here, I'm going to rename this reverb, just to kind of tidy things up for my mix. And on this reverb channel here, in fact, I'm going to change it from mono to stereo. And I'm going to click that, and I'm going to stick my reverb on this channel. I'm going to have one reverb for all of my instruments. I'm going to use the Chroma Verb in Logic. It's a really nice reverb that only came out in the last couple of versions. And usually with reverbs, with compression and EQ, people usually learn how to do these individually and set these levels by choosing the individual parameters. With reverbs, a lot of producers use presets. Even professional ones would reach for example spaces and rooms and stuff. I'm going to choose a room here, I'm going to go through here. Let's try a large room. And basically nothing will happen when we first start this going, because we've not sent any signal here. So if I press play, there's absolutely nothing going to this channel here. But now if we go back to this little tiny little bus one thing you set up before, there's a little dial next to it there. If I turn this up now, it will start to send signal to my bus channel, and it'll trigger this reverb, and we'll start to get some reverb on our track. So let's just have a quick listen to that. And the trick with your reverb, because it's difficult to know how much to put on, the trick with the reverb that I always tell my students to go for is to put enough on there to soften the sound and make it sound like it's in a real place. If you can notice the reverb on a channel, like it's really obvious and it's drenched in reverb, you've put too much on. So you're going to put enough on to soften it up, and so you can kind of hear that it's there, but it's not drowning your channel in reverb. And if you don't like the sound of your reverb, you can always go and change it. So you can always just turn up your guitar a little bit into the reverb, and you could scroll through a few different settings to find one that really suits what you're doing. So basically that's how to set up an individual channel. So if it's guitar or bass, make sure that you've got any amp modeler set up however you want to do them. But if it's not, and it's just a normal channel, you're going to be putting EQ on, which you may or may not be touching. Like I said before, the vocals on here, I'm not going to put any EQ on it because I really like how they sound, and I want to give you an example of not putting EQ on something in a mix. The bass is also going through the bass amp, and I'm really happy about the way that the bass amp has EQ'd the signal, so I'm not going to put any EQ on the bass either. Compression, don't forget, if this is new to you and you don't understand what's happening, use your presets at the top here, and then reverb you set up on a reverb channel here. Just before we move on, I'll recap this in another video because I cannot say this enough. Only put reverb on instruments that are mid and high frequencies. Do not put reverb on any bass instruments. You should not be putting any on your bass amp, and you should not be putting any on your kick drum, because it really muddies the signal and it gets really dense really quickly if you do that. So basically that's this part of the video, which is sorting out each of these channels. What I'm going to do is, in between this video and the next video, I'm going to sort out all the rest of these channels in the same way. So I'm going to put EQ, compression and reverb on, so it's ready to be balanced out. So click on the link to the next video. I'll see you there. Thanks.